To understand the nightmare of the 41st millennium, you have to look past the empires of today and dig into the deep, silent history of the galaxy. You must look at the empty tombs and the broken bones of dead stars. Millions of years before humanity ever took its first breath, the galaxy was already a graveyard. It was the aftermath of a conflict so large and violent that it is known simply as the War in Heaven. But the story does not start with the war itself. It starts with a funeral. Far across the stars, a tragic species known as the Necrontyr struggled to survive. They were born on a harsh world under a radioactive sun that poisoned them from the moment they were born. Their lives were painful, short, and full of grief. Because death was always knocking at their door, they became obsessed with it, building massive tombs and statues to remember the dead. They looked up at the night sky not with wonder, but with pure, boiling jealousy. That jealousy had a target. While the Necrontyr rotted in their short lives, another civilization was thriving. These were the Old Ones. They were the masters of life itself. To the Old Ones, the galaxy was a garden to be tended. They possessed knowledge that looked like magic, shaping reality with their minds and traveling instantly across the universe through a hidden tunnel system known as the Webway. They were essentially immortal, and they filled the stars with their creations, seeding planets with new species like the Aeldari. When the Necrontyr encountered the Old Ones, they begged for the secret to eternal life. The Old Ones refused. That rejection sparked a hatred that would eventually burn the galaxy down. The Necrontyr declared war, but they were quickly beaten back by the superior magic of the Old Ones. Pushed to the edge of extinction and desperate for a way to win, the Necrontyr made a deal with the devil. They found the Catan, ancient, hungry energy beings that fed on the burning hearts of stars. The Catan offered the Necrontyr the immortality they craved, but the cost was terrible. It was a trap. The Necrontyr marched into great biofurnaces, stripping away their weak, radiated flesh. They were replaced with bodies of living metal, becoming the Necrons. In this process, they gained bodies that could never die, but they lost their souls. Now led by their star-eating masters and fueled by cold rage, the Necrons launched the War in Heaven anew. This time, the Old Ones could not stop them. The battles were apocalyptic. Entire solar systems were snuffed out like candles. The war was so intense that it cracked reality, destroying the Old Ones and nearly wiping out all life in the galaxy. However, the victory brought no peace. With their ancient enemies dead, the Necrons turned their weapons on the Catan. They could not kill these star gods, so they shattered them into thousands of pieces, enslaving the shards to use as batteries for their war machines. The galaxy was finally theirs, but it was a ruin. It was empty of life to rule over. So, the silent king of the Necrons ordered his people to rest. They retreated into their massive tomb worlds, locking themselves in stasis crypts. They planned to sleep for 60 million years, waiting for the galaxy to heal and repopulate so they could rise again and reclaim it. The Old Ones are gone, leaving behind only their broken webway and the young races they created. But the echoes of that ancient war are still ringing. The sleepers are starting to wake up, and the 41st millennium is about to remember the horror of the War in Heaven. With the great metal skeletons of the Necrons locked away in their tombs and the Old Ones gone from the stage, the galaxy fell into a silence. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled. And into that empty space stepped the Aeldari. They were the heirs to the galaxy, the favored children of the lost ancients. They didn't just inherit an empire, they inherited the keys to reality. They controlled the Webway, a maze of tunnels that let them step across the universe without ever touching the void. They were beautiful, deadly, and brilliant. For millions of years, no one could touch them. Their armies were perfect, and their science looked like magic to anyone else. But when you have no enemies, your worst enemy becomes yourself. The Aeldari grew bored. They had won the game of survival, so they stopped looking outward and started looking inward. They became obsessed with feeling. They wanted to experience every sensation, every joy, and every dark thrill possible. They built a society of pure excess. They didn't realize that their minds were powerful beacons, and their obsession was bleeding into the other side of reality. In the warp, the dimension of souls, a storm was gathering. The Aeldari were partying in a palace, unaware that they were building a bomb in the basement. While the masters of the galaxy were slowly dancing toward their doom, a different story was starting on a small, muddy rock called Earth. Under a yellow sun, humanity was waking up. We started as shivering animals, banging stones together, but we had something the Aeldari had lost: hunger. We were desperate to know what was over the next hill, across the next ocean, and eventually above the sky. We built mud huts, then stone pyramids, then towers of glass. Empires rose and fell: Sumer, Egypt, Rome. Each one thinking it would last forever, each one turning to dust. But the species kept moving. We mastered fire, then steam, then the atom. By the 3rd millennium, we had kicked off the dirt of our home world. We put footprints on the moon and built domes on the red sands of Mars, but the solar system was a cage. The stars were too far away. To reach them, we had to cheat. Scientists found the Imperium, the warp. It was a shadow realm where distance didn't matter. If you could punch a hole in reality and survive the trip through hell, you could cross the galaxy in weeks instead of centuries. It was dangerous business. Early ships would vanish or come back with crews that had lost their minds, screaming about voices in the walls. But humans have always been willing to pay a high price for glory. We built shields to hold back the madness, and we pushed out into the black. Humanity spread like a virus. We terraformed dead rocks into green worlds. We mined asteroids and built massive cities in the void. It was a time of wild expansion. Corporations and governments fought over resources, and small wars flared up constantly. We were a mess, a scattered, brawling collection of republics and dictatorships. But we were free. Or so we thought. We didn't know that the warp wasn't just weather. It was alive. The monsters that sailors talked about weren't hallucinations. They were predators waiting in the deep water. And while humanity played with fire, one man watched from the cold. He had been with us the whole time. History remembers him as the Emperor, but back then, he was just a shadow. Legends say he was born thousands of years ago, created when the shamans of the ancient tribes realized their souls were being eaten by the warp. To save their people, they killed themselves, stitching their spirits together into one body. A single, immortal protector. He was the anchor. He walked among us for millennia, wearing 1,000 different faces. He was the advisor whispering in the ear of a king, the scientist discovering a new cure, the general winning an impossible battle. He nudged humanity away from extinction, always pushing us toward the light. He saw us at our worst, our greed, our cruelty, our short-sightedness. But he also saw our spark. He saw the courage that made a man walk into a dark cave or launch a ship into a nightmare dimension. He stayed hidden because he wanted us to learn to walk on our own. But as the 25th millennium approached, the galaxy began to darken. The Aeldari's psychic scream was reaching a breaking point. The warp was boiling. The Emperor looked at the stars and saw that the time for gentle guidance was over. The storms were coming. He knew that if humanity remained fractured, fighting over money and petty borders, we would be swallowed whole. He realized he could no longer just be a teacher. He had to become a warlord. He began to lay the groundwork for a new kind of empire. He needed to forge the tribes of Earth and the tech cults of Mars into a single weapon. He started to prepare for the day when he would have to step out of the shadows, take the reins, and drag humanity kicking and screaming into a future where it could survive the horrors waiting in the dark. The time of the Imperium was drawing near. For generations, gravity was a jail cell. We were prisoners of our own biology, stuck on a single blue rock while the galaxy turned without us. Even when we finally kicked free of Earth's atmosphere in the third millennium, settling the gray dust of the moon and the red deserts of Mars, we were still just crawling in our own backyard. The stars, the real prize, remained untouchable. The laws of physics were a cruel wall. Traveling to another solar system with standard engines meant a crew would die of old age long before they ever saw a new sun. We were trapped by distance. We needed a miracle or a cheat. We found both in the warp. Scientists discovered that beneath the skin of reality lay another dimension, a roiling ocean of pure energy called the Imperium. By punching a hole into this realm, a ship could slip out of the physical world, ride the tides of this alternate space, and pop back into reality light years away. It was the key to the universe, but it came coated in blood. The early tests were less like exploration and more like human sacrifice. Ships launched into the breach and simply vanished. When they did return, they were often drifting tombs. Survivors raved about voices scratching at the inside of their skulls and geometry that hurt to look at. We learned quickly that the warp wasn't just a highway, it was a mirror that reflected emotion, and it was hungry. The barrier between a man's mind and the raw energy of that place was paper-thin. But human ambition has always been stronger than fear. We didn't stop, we just built better armor. Engineers developed energy cages and reality bubbles to wrap around our ships, shielding the crews from the madness outside. Once we could travel without instantly losing our minds, the floodgates opened. Humanity exploded outwards. We didn't just visit worlds, we tamed them. On airless rocks, we built domed cities and subterranean hydroponic gardens. On lush planets, we established new nations that eventually forgot where Earth even was. Cultures drifted apart, declaring independence and forming a chaotic tapestry of human civilization across the dark. It felt like the dawn of a new golden age, where anything was possible. But the shadows were getting longer. Deep in the warp, things were moving. This wasn't just bad weather, it was malice. Colony ships began to disappear in sudden, impossible storms. Those who stared too long into the void reported that the energy wasn't just flowing, it was watching. We were brushing up against the entities that would later be known as the forces of chaos, though at the time we were too arrogant to realize they were predators. We called them aliens or hallucinations, refusing to see the demons waiting in the water. Back in the solar system, the foundation for survival was being poured. While Earth provided the blood and the drive, Mars had become a planet of machines. The tech cults there had already begun to worship technology, turning science into a theology of gears and oil. A silent partnership formed between the two worlds, Earth's manpower and Mars's steel. It was this alliance that would eventually build the skeleton of the Imperium. We had unlocked the galaxy, but we had also knocked on the door of hell, and soon something was going to answer. By the time the 25th millennium arrived, humanity felt like it was on the verge of winning the galaxy. We were spreading like wildfire, pushing our ships through the warp and planting flags on thousands of new worlds. We were confident, aggressive, and completely blind to the fact that the floor was about to drop out from under us. While we were busy celebrating our new empire, the true masters of the galaxy were busy committing a slow, glamorous suicide. The Aeldari had ruled the stars for so long that they had forgotten what struggle felt like. To them, humans were just clever monkeys playing with fire. The Aeldari had no need for clumsy starships or dangerous warp jumps. They moved through the webway, a hidden labyrinth that let them step across the universe without ever getting their boots dirty. They were beautiful, ancient, and untouchable. They had conquered hunger, disease, and war. But when a species has nothing left to fight for, it starts to rot from the inside. Boredom became their only enemy. To escape the dullness of perfection, the Aeldari turned to sensation. They wanted to feel everything, every joy, every pain, every taboo. What started as art and music spiraled into obsession and cruelty. Cults of pleasure took over their society, pushing the boundaries of morality until their streets ran with blood and wine. They didn't realize that their minds were powerful beacons. The Aeldari are a psychic race, and every burst of intense emotion they felt created a ripple in the warp. For centuries, their collective depravity pooled together in the other dimension, feeding a growing, malignant consciousness. They were partying in a golden palace, unaware that they were birthing a monster in the basement. Then, the levee broke. The gathered energy of 1 trillion twisted minds ignited. It wasn't just an explosion. It was the birth of a god. Slaanesh, the Dark Prince of Chaos, screamed into existence. The shockwave was apocalyptic. In a single heartbeat, the heart of the Aeldari Empire was ripped out. Billions of Aeldari dropped dead instantly, their souls sucked from their bodies and devoured by the newborn entity they had created. The epicenter of this catastrophe shattered the laws of physics permanently, creating the bleeding wound in space known as the Eye of Terror. The Aeldari were finished, but the shockwave didn't stop with them. It rolled across the galaxy and smashed into humanity. The birth of Slaanesh whipped the warp into a frenzy of storms that would last for 5,000 years. Space travel became impossible instantly. The trade routes that kept human civilization alive were severed. Imagine a world that relies on food from a neighboring system. Suddenly, the ships stop coming, the radios go silent, and the sky turns the color of a bruise. Isolation brought madness. Without the central government of Earth to keep order, the great human federation crumbled into thousands of lonely, starving planets. This was the beginning of the Old Night. On Earth itself, the collapse was total. The cradle of humanity turned into a slaughterhouse. As the government dissolved, brutal warlords rose from the ashes. These were the techno-barbarians. They were tyrants who draped themselves in the rusted scraps of the Golden Age, wielding radioactive weapons and commanding armies of gene-bulked savages. They fought over water, fuel, and the crumbling ruins of ancient laboratories. The majestic cities of the past were ground into dust. Science was no longer a tool for progress. It was a weapon for survival, guarded jealously by a few desperate survivors. Humanity had regressed to a state of high-tech primitive warfare, fighting with lasers in the morning and sleeping in caves at night. However, 2 small flames remained in the dark. On the red planet, Mars, the collapse took a different shape. Instead of anarchy, they turned to dogma. The scientists and engineers formed cults to preserve the knowledge of the ancients. They began to worship the machines they maintained, believing that every engine had a spirit. They prayed to the Omnissiah, the machine god, creating a religion of steel and oil that would one day become the Adeptus Mechanicus. And deep in the warp, the storms raged on. The few ships that dared to leave their planets during this long night rarely returned. The ones that did brought back tales that sounded like hallucinations, stories of demons that defied logic, of creatures made of teeth and fire that hunted in the void. We had lost the stars, and in the darkness, the wolves were beginning to circle. When the great storms that had choked the solar system for 5,000 years finally broke, they revealed a version of Earth that was barely recognizable. It was no longer a cradle of civilization. It was a graveyard. The planet was a patchwork of radioactive dust, ruled by warlords who fought over the scraps of the past, with rusted weapons and stolen technology. In this chaos, the Emperor made his move. He decided that humanity could no longer be allowed to destroy itself. It was time to force peace upon the world, whether it wanted it or not. To do this, he didn't ask for volunteers. He built monsters. These were the Thunder Warriors. They were the rough drafts of the super soldiers that would come later, massive, chemically pumped brutes who were stronger than anything else on the planet. They were unstable, raging, and short-lived, but they were perfect for the slaughter that was needed. With these living weapons, the Emperor marched across the irradiated wastes of Terra. He crushed the techno-barbarian tribes and tore down the fortresses of tyrants. It was a time of absolute butchery. The choice given to the defeated was simple: bend the knee to the new order or be erased from history. But the Emperor knew that muscle alone wasn't enough. He looked to the red rust fields of Mars. The tech priests there worshipped technology as a god, and they sat on a stockpile of ancient machines and factories. The Emperor forged a pact with them. It was a union of Earth's flesh and Mars's steel. This alliance became the heartbeat of the new Imperium, giving the Emperor the industrial power he needed to look toward the stars. Once Terra was secure, a dark silence fell over the Thunder Warriors. They had served their purpose, but a tool made for pure murder has no place in a peaceful society. Rumors say they were culled by the Emperor's own hand, put down like rabid dogs before they could turn on the population they had just unified. With the old warriors dead and the planet rebuilding, the Emperor declared the birth of the Imperium of mankind. He renamed cities, built towering monuments, and turned the entire planet into a launch pad for a war that would span the galaxy. He dreamed of a galaxy where humanity was safe, united, and dominant. But to conquer 1 billion worlds, he needed generals who were more than just men. Deep in his genetic laboratories, buried beneath the highest mountains of the world, the Emperor began his masterpiece, the Primarch Project. He created 20 sons, crafting them from his own DNA and using lost science to make them demigods. Each one was built to lead, to fight, and to govern, representing a different facet of the Emperor's own genius. They were to be the fathers of the Space Marine legions, genetic templates for armies of millions. But the enemies in the shadows struck first. The gods of chaos, terrifying entities that live in the warp, saw the threat these Primarchs posed. In a moment of catastrophe, they reached into the laboratory and snatched the infant Primarchs away. The 20 sons were scattered into the void, landing on strange, distant worlds across the galaxy. The Emperor was left with a broken plan, but he did not hesitate. He still had the genetic blueprints. He used the leftover samples to mass-produce the Legion's Astartes, the Space Marines. They were not as powerful as the Primarchs, but there were thousands of them. Leading these armies himself, the Emperor launched the Great Crusade. His goal was simple: find his lost sons and bring the scattered human colonies back into the fold. The Imperial fleets moved outward like a tidal wave. They found human civilizations that had been cut off for millennia. Some of these worlds had regressed to the Stone Age. Others had preserved high technology and looked down on the Imperium as barbarians. It didn't matter. The ultimatum was the same for everyone: join the Imperium and live, or resist and be crushed. Luck, or perhaps destiny, was on the Emperor's side. One by one, he found his lost children. The reunions were legendary. The Primarchs had grown up to be kings, slaves, or gladiators on the worlds where they had landed. When the Emperor arrived, most recognized him instantly as their father. He gave each Primarch command of the Space Marine Legion that shared his blood. Reunited with their gene fathers, the legions became unstoppable. It was a golden age of conquest. The Primarchs were viewed as invincible heroes, demigods walking among mortals. They shattered alien empires and burned the orcs from the stars, Humanity felt untouchable. But this feeling of safety was a lie. The Emperor's vision was blind to the rot growing inside his own house. Few people stopped to think about what was watching them from the warp. The Great Crusade had built a mighty wall around humanity, but it had trapped the enemy inside with them. The stage was set for a tragedy that would burn the galaxy down, proving that the brightest lights cast the longest, darkest shadows. The smoke from the Horus heresy eventually cleared, but the galaxy it revealed was broken. The Emperor was no longer the Golden Warrior, leading his people from the front lines. He was a silent, rotting husk chained to the Golden Throne. He sat between life and death, his mind screaming into the void to keep the navigation beacons lit. In that terrible silence, something fundamental changed in the human soul. For centuries, the Emperor had preached the imperial truth. He had taught that there were no gods, only science and reason. He had burned down churches and forbidden worship because he knew that faith fueled the monsters of the warp. But with the Emperor silent and the horrors of demons fresh in everyone's minds, reason wasn't enough to keep the darkness at bay. People were terrified. They looked at the corpse on the throne and they didn't see a fallen king. They saw a martyr. They saw a god. It started in the gutters, in the trench lines, whispered prayers to the God Emperor to save them from the monsters. Soon, those whispers became shouts. The very thing the Emperor had spent his life trying to destroy became the foundation of his empire. The ecclesiarchy rose up, a massive, monolithic church that turned the Emperor's secular laws into holy scripture. They built cathedrals the size of cities, drowning out the hum of machinery with the sound of chanting choirs. The logic of the past was buried. In its place came a culture of fanaticism, the administrative machinery of the Imperium, the tax collectors, the generals, the planetary governors, all merged with this new religious fervor. It was no longer enough to be a loyal citizen. You had to be a pious one. If you questioned the government, you weren't just a criminal, you were a heretic. This shift was tragic, but in a galaxy full of literal demons, faith became a shield. It was the glue that kept a crumbling empire from falling apart. This religious fever didn't stop with the common people. It infected the very engines that kept humanity alive. On the red planet of Mars, the Adeptus Mechanicus had always been a strange ally. They didn't worship the Emperor as a man. They saw him as the physical shell of the Omnissiah, the machine god. As the millennia ground on, the line between engineering and theology vanished completely. Technology ceased to be something you understood. It became something you worshipped. To a tech priest in the 35th millennium, a plasma reactor wasn't a machine made of physics and fuel. It was a sacred shrine containing a machine spirit. You didn't repair a broken tank with a wrench and a schematic. You soothed it with holy oils, burnt incense, and sang binary psalms to appease its anger. It sounds insane, but it worked. Since nobody really understood how the ancient technology functioned anymore, treating it with terrified superstition ensured that uneducated workers didn't mess with things they shouldn't touch. The maintenance of the Imperium became a ritual. Ignorance became a virtue. By the time the 41st millennium arrived, the Imperium was a bloated, rotting carcass of its former self, held together by fear, hatred, and the sheer momentum of 1 trillion souls praying to a silent master. But while the Imperium was busy repressing its own citizens, the old enemy was waking up. For 10,000 years, the traitor legions had been locked in the Eye of Terror. They had not been idle. They had been fighting, mutating, and growing stronger in the Hell Realm. Leading them was Abaddon, the Despoiler. He was the son of Horus, the heir to the greatest traitor of them all, and he had spent millennia consolidating his power. He launched 12 Black Crusades against the Imperium. For a long time, Imperial commanders thought these were just random raids, failed attempts to break out. They were wrong. Abaddon wasn't just raiding, he was dismantling the cage. Then came the 13th Black Crusade. This was the endgame. Abaddon threw the full weight of the traitor legions at a single target, Cadia. Cadia was not just a planet, it was the most heavily fortified rock in human history. It sat directly in the mouth of the Eye of Terror, the only stable route out of hell. For thousands of years, the Cadian shock troopers had held the line. Their entire culture was built around war. Children learned to field strip a lasgun before they learned to write. The saying, "Cadia stands," wasn't just a motto, it was a fact of life. As long as Cadia existed, the Chaos fleets were bottled up. The battle for Cadia was apocalyptic. The sky burned as thousands of warships hammered each other in orbit. On the ground, millions of soldiers clashed in the ruins of fortress cities. Titans, god machines the size of skyscrapers, dueled with demonic engines that defied the laws of physics. The air itself turned into poison. The defenders fought with a grit that has become legendary, pushing back wave after wave of horrors. But Abaddon had not come to conquer Cadia. He'd come to destroy it. Realizing he couldn't take the planet by conventional means, Abaddon committed an act of supreme spite. He rammed his massive flagship, the Will of Eternity, into the planet's surface. The impact was cataclysmic. It cracked the planet's crust and destabilized the ancient alien pylons that had been holding back the warp. The planet died. The ground shattered, the atmosphere burned away, and the brave millions of the Cadian Guard were swallowed by fire. But even as their world broke apart beneath their boots, they kept firing. The legend says the planet broke before the Guard did. But bravery couldn't stop physics. With Cadia gone, the dam broke. The Eye of Terror didn't just expand, it ripped the galaxy open. A massive tear in reality, known as the Cicatrix Maledictum or the Great Rift, surged outward at the speed of thought. It cut the galaxy in half, stretching from one side of the galactic disk to the other. It was a wound in the universe that bled pure madness. The consequences were instant and terrifying. The Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic lighthouse that guided all ships through the warp, was blocked by the storm. Half the galaxy was suddenly plunged into total darkness. This created a divided empire. On one side of the rift was the Imperium Sanctus. This region still held Terra and Mars. It was battered, besieged, and frightened, but the light of the Emperor still reached it. They could still travel, coordinate, and fight back. On the other side lay the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. Here, thousands of human worlds were cut off. They were blind. They couldn't call for help. They couldn't see the guiding light, and they couldn't escape. The rift bled warp energy onto these worlds, causing nightmares to manifest in reality. Demons stepped out of mirrors. Psychers lost their minds and turned into portals for monsters. Civilizations that had stood for millennia collapsed in weeks as panic and anarchy took over. The Great Rift changed the rules of the game. We are no longer looking at a war for territory. We are looking at a war for survival. The stable stagnation of the last few thousand years is over. The borders are gone. Now the Imperium is fighting with its back against the wall. The administrative machine is overwhelmed. Reports of entire sectors going silent are piling up unread. The only thing keeping humanity from total extinction is the frenzied, desperate faith in the God Emperor. We have returned to a time of myths and monsters, where the only hope lies in the roar of a bolter and the prayer on a dying soldier's lips. The galaxy has been split in two, and in the darkness of the rift, the laughter of thirsting gods is getting louder. For 10,000 years, the Imperium told itself a comforting lie. The traitor legions were broken, scattered, and locked away in their hell prison. But this was wishful thinking. In the deep dark of the Eye of Terror, the hatred of the past was not fading, it was festering. The architect of this long nightmare was Abaddon the Despoiler. He was the heir to Horus, the monster who nearly killed the Emperor. Abaddon had spent millennia gathering the broken shards of the traitor armies, forcing them to kneel through sheer brutality and will. He launched 12 Black Crusades against the Imperium over the centuries. To the High Lords of Terror, these looked like random, violent raids that were beaten back each time. But Abaddon was playing a longer game. He was testing the fences, weakening the foundations, and preparing for the final stroke. At the closing of the 41st millennium, the 13th hammer blow finally fell. The target was not a random world. It was the linchpin of human survival. It was Cadia. To understand the tragedy that followed, you have to understand what Cadia was. It wasn't just a fortress. It was the cork in the bottle. The Eye of Terror is a massive, bleeding wound in reality where the laws of physics don't apply, and Cadia sat right in the center of the only stable route out of it. This stretch of space, known as the Cadian Gate, was the only place where the traitor fleets could exit the warp in massive numbers without being torn apart by storms. For generations, the entire population of Cadia existed for one purpose: war. Children learned to field strip a laser rifle before they learned to read. Every city was a bunker. Every building was a strong point. They were the best soldiers the human race had to offer, and they stood on the wall of reality, daring the darkness to come and get them. And then, the darkness arrived. Abaddon didn't just bring an army, he brought an apocalypse. The sky above Cadia turned the color of a bruise as the 13th Black Crusade arrived. The void was filled with the twisted warships of the Black Legion, accompanied by shrieking hordes of demons and the cultists who worshipped them. The battle that followed was arguably the most intense conflict humanity had seen in thousands of years. It was a grinder that chewed up millions of lives. In the orbit above, ships the size of cities traded broadsides until the wreckage formed a new ring around the planet. On the surface, the mud turned red. The brave regiments of the Astra Militarum, the Cadian shock troopers, dug in their heels. They were joined by the towering god machines of the Adeptus Mechanicus and several chapters of Space Marines, including the Space Wolves and Dark Angels. It was absolute hell. Reality itself began to thin. Warp portals tore open in the middle of trench lines, spilling blood-drinking monsters directly onto the defenders, but Cadia held. The discipline of its people was ironclad. For a brief, shining moment, it looked like the Imperium might actually win. They drove the Chaos forces back, contesting every inch of ground with a ferocity that surprised even the Despoiler. But Abaddon had grown tired of fair fights. He realized that as long as Cadia existed, he could not win. So he decided that if he couldn't capture the gate, he would break it. In a final act of spite, Abaddon took the wreckage of his massive alien star fortress, the Will of Eternity, and rammed it straight into the planet. Physics took over where strategy ended. The impact was cataclysmic. It cracked the planetary crust. Massive earthquakes shattered the fortress cities that had stood for millennia. The ancient alien pylons that stabilized reality on the surface toppled over. The phrase, "Cadia stands," had been the rallying cry of the Imperium for generations. But on that day, the ground literally broke beneath the soldiers' feet. The planet died in fire and agony. The survivors fought until the atmosphere burned away, leading to the grim new saying, "The planet broke before the god did." The destruction of Cadia was not just a military defeat. It was a spiritual and strategic disaster. With the lock broken, the Eye of Terror ripped open. The barrier that had kept the warp storms contained for 10,000 years evaporated. The forces of chaos were no longer bottled up. They were free to pour into the galaxy like water through a broken dam, setting the stage for a nightmare that would split the Imperium in two. The death of Cadia was not the end of the war, it was the beginning of the nightmare. When the fortress world cracked apart, the physical barrier that had held back hell for 10,000 years simply evaporated. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The warp didn't just leak into the galaxy, it flooded it. A tear in the fabric of reality ripped across the stars, stretching from one side of the galactic disk to the other. This is the Great Rift. To the people of the Imperium, it is the Cicatrix Maledictum, a jagged scar of purple fire and screaming ghosts that splits the night sky in two. It was a disaster that changed the geography of the universe. The Imperium of mankind, once a single, sprawling domain, was severed. On one side of this wall of storms lies the Imperium Sanctus. This is the half that was lucky. It contains Earth, Mars, and the seat of government. Here, the light of the Astronomicon, the Emperor's psychic beacon, can still be seen. Ships can still travel, armies can still be mustered, and there is a semblance of order, however desperate. On the other side lies the Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium. Here, the Emperor's light is blocked by the storm. Thousands of human star systems were suddenly plunged into blindness. They cannot send messages to Terra. They cannot navigate safely. They are trapped in the dark with the monsters. The panic in this region was absolute. Without the guiding light, supply lines vanished. Worlds that relied on food imports starved within months, but hunger was the least of their problems. The rift acted like a megaphone for the warp. On planets that had been safe for centuries, reality began to dissolve. Demons didn't need to be summoned anymore. They just walked out of the shadows. Madness swept through populations like a virus. Cults dedicated to the chaos gods rose up from the underhives, overthrowing planetary governors and offering entire cities as sacrifices to their dark masters. It was a time of anarchy, where the colossal, clumsy machinery of the imperial government finally ground to a halt. It could no longer protect its people. The sheep were separated from the shepherd, and the wolves were eating their fill. Humanity was teetering on the edge of extinction. The High Lords of Terra were paralyzed, watching their maps turn red as sector after sector went silent. They needed a miracle, but miracles were in short supply in the 41st millennium. Yet, in the depths of this despair, a rumor began to spread. It sounded like madness, a story about a hero from the ancient past returning to save them. For 10,000 years, Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, had been a frozen statue. He had been sitting in stasis within the fortress of Hera, trapped in the final second of his life, his throat slashed by a poisoned blade during the old wars. He was a relic, a tourist attraction for pilgrims, a reminder of a better age that was dead and gone. Most people believed he would never move again. But necessity breeds strange alliances. A rogue genius of the Adeptus Mechanicus named Belisarius Cawl had been working in secret for centuries. He carried technology that bordered on heresy, convinced he could fix what was broken, but he couldn't do it alone. He found help from an unlikely and dangerous source, the Aeldari, specifically a faction known as the Ynnari, followers of the god of death. It was a desperate gamble. In the middle of a war zone, while chaos forces battered down the doors, the alien witch Ivrain and the mad scientist Cawl came together over the Primarch's body. They combined the cold steel of Mars with the soul magic of the Aeldari. It was a ritual that should have failed. But the stasis field flickered and died. The Primarch's wounds knit together, and then Roboute Guilliman opened his eyes. The shock that went through the room, and soon the galaxy was electric. This wasn't a saint or a statue. This was a demigod of war, breathing and furious. He was outfitted in the armor of fate, a masterpiece of life support engineering, and he immediately did what he was born to do. He took command. However, the resurrection was bitter. Guilliman had gone to sleep in an era of reason and hope. He woke up in a nightmare of superstition and decay. He looked at the Imperium and saw a rotting carcass. He saw that the people worshipped his father as a god, something the Emperor had always forbidden. He saw a government that was cruel, stupid, and inefficient. He saw that humanity had forgotten how to invent, how to think, and how to hope. For a moment, he was filled with a cold, burning rage. He wanted to tear it all down. But Guilliman was a pragmatist. He realized that this broken, superstitious empire was the only shield humanity had left. If he destroyed it, chaos would win. So he pushed his anger down and picked up his sword. He wasted no time. He bypassed the weeping priests and the stunned bureaucrats and seized total control. He declared himself Lord Commander of the Imperium. He rallied the fractured Space Marine chapters, the battered Imperial Guard, and the navies. He unlocked the vaults of Belisarius Cawl to unleash the Primaris Marines, new, stronger warriors that had been kept secret for thousands of years. He launched the Indomitus Crusade. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was a rescue mission. He took his fleets into the dark, smashing through the blockades and bringing fire to the enemies of man. For the first time in millennia, the Imperium had a leader. They had a voice that could shout back at the dark. But Guilliman knows the truth that the priests ignore. The Golden Age is not coming back. He is not fixing the Imperium. He is merely keeping it alive. He is a man out of time, fighting a war he knows he might not win, standing in the ashes of his father's dream and refusing to let the last ember die out. Roboute Guilliman's awakening didn't just change the war, it shocked the heart of the human race. For 10,000 years, the Imperium had been slowly dying, suffocated by its own weight. When the Primarch opened his eyes, he saw that the Great Rift had pushed humanity to the edge of the cliff. He didn't hesitate. He knew that standing still meant death, so he declared a counterattack that would shake the stars, the Indomitus Crusade. This wasn't just a military march. It was a desperate rescue mission. To make this possible, the mad genius of the Adeptus Mechanicus, Archimagos Belisarius Cawl, finally revealed the secret he had been keeping for millennia. He opened his vaults and unleashed the Primaris Space Marines. These weren't just replacements for the fallen, they were upgrades. Bigger, stronger, and more genetically stable than their older brothers, the Primaris were the reinforcement that the exhausted Space Marine chapters had been praying for. The old warriors had been bleeding out for centuries, their numbers thinning against the endless tide. The Primaris were the fresh blood transfusion that the Imperium needed to keep its heart beating. With these new legions at his back, Guilliman launched his fleets. The goal was simple but terrifying: punch through the darkness, re-establish contact with the silent worlds, and remind the galaxy that humanity was not done fighting. But the galaxy fought back with everything it had. While Guilliman tried to stitch the Imperium back together, the enemies of man smelled blood. The Orcs, sensing the chaos, launched massive invasions. Led by colossal war bosses, the green tide swept over entire sectors. Orcs don't care about politics or borders. They only care about violence. They turned prosperous industrial worlds into scrapyards and slaughterhouses. They didn't negotiate. They just smashed. The Imperium had to divert huge amounts of manpower just to stop these brute force avalanches from crushing the outer colonies. Yet the Orcs were loud and predictable. A quieter, hungrier threat was coming from the dark between the stars. The Tyranids were adapting. These alien locusts were driving their hive fleets deep into human space, targeting worlds that had been cut off by the warp storms. Isolated and alone, these colonies were easy meat. The Tyranids stripped them bare, drinking the oceans and eating every scrap of organic life until nothing was left but dead rock. At the same time, the ground itself began to betray humanity. On 1,000 different worlds, the soil cracked open to reveal the metallic tombs of the Necrons. These ancient, soulless androids were waking up from a 60-million-year sleep. They marched in perfect, silent unison, disintegrated armies with beams of green lightning. Worse still, rumors began to drift through the void that their supreme leader, the Silent King, had returned from exile. His goal was terrifyingly simple: to rebuild his dynasty and enslave the galaxy once again. And through it all, the laughter of the Chaos Gods echoed from the rift. The traitor legions knew that the Imperium was wounded. They slipped through the cracks in the defensive lines, specifically targeting the Imperium Nihilus, the half of the galaxy, trapped in the dark. There, they didn't just fight soldiers, they corrupted souls. Rebellions and cults sprouted like weeds. On worlds where the governor was weak or the people were starving, the promises of the Dark Gods sounded sweet. Guilliman found himself fighting a war on two fronts, one against the monsters outside the walls and one against the rot inside them. The Primarch quickly realized that his biggest enemy wasn't always an alien or a demon. Sometimes it was his own government. The Imperium had become a bloated, rusty machine. It was choked by bureaucracy and ruled by men who were more interested in tradition than survival. When Guilliman tried to move resources or change tactics, he often hit a wall of stubborn refusal from the High Lords and the Church. They feared change almost as much as they feared the enemy. But Guilliman was relentless. He used his authority as the Emperor's son to force the gears to turn. He strengthened the alliance with Mars, demanding that the Forges run hot day and night to arm the new Primaris warriors. He purged the corrupt officials and replaced them with soldiers who knew how to get things done. The arrival of the Primaris Marines on the front lines changed the math of the war. These giants proved they could hold ground that would have been lost otherwise. They became the anchors of the Crusade, turning defeats into stalemates and stalemates into victories. The Indomitus Crusade did not fix the galaxy. The galaxy is too broken for that. But it stopped the bleeding. It proved to the soldiers in the mud and the citizens in the manufactorums that they had not been abandoned. For the first time in an age, there was a leader at the helm who actually knew how to steer the ship. This era is still a time of horror. The Tyrannids are still eating, the Orcs are still burning, and the Rift is still screaming. But it is also a time of defiance. The return of the Primarch proved that even in the 42nd millennium, when the night is at its darkest, the spirit of the Emperor is still alive, fighting tooth and nail for the soul of mankind.